Okay, hi everybody. We'll start this. This is a great day for me because I'm going to be passing off a lot of the speaking remarks to Christina Canet. I'm going to tell you all about Christina in a moment here. So now, Dorothy Dundas, where are you, Dorothy? There you are, great. So, daughter of Brad Washburn, welcome. So, it's so great to have you down here, and thanks very much for coming, and congratulations. And we joked that you said this was the first time you'd come to the Whaling Museum. Hopefully it won't be the last, but I suspect you've been brought through many a science museum when you were a kid before. We love going to the Museum of Science and plagiarizing every great idea they've got up there. I want to extend my thanks to Tony for everything you've done for us, and thanks for that fabulous show upstairs. I just think it's so stunning, and we love the kind of the robust nature of exhibits here and what you brought down, and it all came out so effortlessly. I know Michael's going to talk a lot about this, but we welcome you, and thanks very much for what you're doing, and we hope that all our visitors over the next few months enjoy the show as much as we are. Well, now, a lady to introduce tonight is our new curator of collections and exhibitions. Christina Canet joins us from Jamestown, Rhode Island. She's about a week on the job, or 3 days on the job, or so? 4 days on the job. So she's going to talk in depth about all matters here. She knows more than any of us. Her father, many of you will remember Steve Canet, or granddad George Canet from Nonquit, right? Peyton Aram. And George was on the board here way back when. And Christina has sailed a lot, been in America's Cup family, gone through 3 or 4 campaigns or so, swum with the turtles and tagged the sharks, so she's got blue water swimming in her veins, and was most recently professor down at RISD. So we wish you well, and we welcome you to the museum community, and knowing that you're going to do just great things here. So a round of applause to Christina. She's going to defend her thesis on something or other that she told me about, cartology or something like that, in Valencia. And we were curious when we looked at her resume why she got her master's degree in New Zealand, and she's defending her thesis in Valencia, and she's at the Whaling Museum. But if you follow the America's Cup campaigns, you'll know exactly what's going on here. So we expect Larry Allison to come in here shortly. So, okay, that's what I'm going to stop here. I'm going to pass this over to Christina, and I want to thank Michael and congratulate Michael for this series, this kind of train of events, which have now been working and fermenting and brewing and will be continuing over the course of the year, of course starting with the Arctic Visions exhibit that the Wilburns underwrote for us, which are in the Waddles Gallery. So if you have not seen it, and for those who are first-time visitors here, please look around the galleries, but don't leave without checking out the exhibit in the Waddles Gallery, which is contextual and, of course, links up with Tony's exhibit upstairs. So do check that out. Congratulations, Michael, and Russell. We're looking forward to your talk tonight. It's good to have you back, and thanks for everything. So, Christina.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, James. I couldn't be more thrilled to join the Whaling Museum as curator, and as all of you know, this is an incredibly engaging and dynamic place, evidence of which is in the excellent lineup of speakers for this Lyceum and the quality of the exhibition opening tonight, curated by Michael Lapidis. On that note, I want to introduce Michael, the curator of digital initiatives and also of the Arctic Visions exhibition and 100 Years of Mountain Photography. And again, if you haven't had a chance to go visit that tonight yet, please do so. It is a really exquisite, beautiful exhibition, as well as the Arctic Visions, which I know you've all spent many hours in already. As an art historian, when I look at the photographs produced by the 2 remarkable men represented in the 100 Years of Mountain Photography, I'm reminded of the exquisite paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, who was a German romantic painter of the 19th century and slightly predated Bradford. And I was really drawn, which was interesting just talking to Russell too, by the connection that Michael, knowingly or not, made with this incredible painter. Is one of my favorite landscape painters in the world, where his work, The Wanderer, if you're not familiar with that, it's of a man standing on a mountaintop, looking from the back, looking out over this incredible mountainscape. Gorgeous, gorgeous painting of really the enormity of nature and our relationship to it, with this incredible spiritual sort of revelatory kind of tone to it. But it also connects very much to the Bradford exhibition in the luminosity of this German romantic painter. And so it's a really nice connection for these two different pieces. So I wanted to thank you, Michael, for such an excellent show. Being my first week, this is a pretty phenomenal exhibition to be introducing, and an incredible speaker. And Russell, actually, as I was saying, I was kind of sad I don't have images of these two Friedrich paintings, but apparently Russell's going to talk about them, so, so it's perfect. So you'll get to see them in a minute. Oh, sorry, I'm sort of in and out of this, microphone. So I'll turn the podium over to you, Michael, to talk a little bit more. I don't want to steal Russell's thunder, but thank you so much for your welcome, and look forward to the speaker tonight. It's going to be really wonderful.
Thank you, Christina and James, and welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here. I really wanted to echo James's comments and Christina's to thank Tony for joining us for this with this loan for this wonderful exhibit. And really, if you haven't seen it, please do go and have a look. And also, this is kind of a shameless plug, but if you're interested in purchasing any, you should also find Tony. And those purchases, if they happen, will help also benefit the museum. So please look with that in mind as well. So this year, just a few words about the series. The Lyceum this year centered on the Arctic visions. Tonight is the first of 4 lectures, and the next are coming up October 3rd, the 24th, and the 14th. The October 3rd lecture will be given by Kevin Avery. He's a senior research scholar and former associate curator at the Met Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and his lecture is entitled Sea of Ice, the Art of Exploration. And tonight, we're privileged, as we've heard, to have Russell Potter. He's a professor of English and media studies at Rhode Island College. He's written on a wide range of topics, including hip-hop, 19th century polar exploration and visual culture, which seems a little more fitting for tonight, perhaps, and panoramas. His book, Arctic Spectacles, is a must-read, really, if you're intrigued and fascinated by these stories. Russell was, and still is, in fact, a key advisor and contributor to Arctic Visions. On more than a few occasions, he kept me on the right path, I can say that. And he opened doors, certainly, that would not have been open. So thank you, Russell. I appreciate that. As Christina mentioned, I am the curator of digital initiatives, so a shameless plug for this. This all started on the wiki, inviting people to join in, and then on our website and our blog. And it grew through social media, and tonight is hashtag OD Lyceum 2013. I know a lot of people will be tweeting from here tonight. But Russell's been involved all along, including the republication of William Bradford's Arctic region. So with that, I want to say welcome, Russell, and look forward to your talk.
As I was saying to those sitting next to me, if I clear my throat, it is not a signal of any kind. It means I'm clearing my throat. All right. There we go. So my talk tonight is going to be a kind of a parallel set of histories. One of them is a kind of a thumbnail history of Arctic exploration in the 19th century, and the other is a history, brief as it must be, of the depiction of these explorations and explorers. We take it for granted that if somebody discovers someplace new, or a new planet, or a new asteroid or something, we'll be seeing a photograph of it on the evening news. But during this period of extraordinary advances in polar exploration, there really wasn't any direct way for people back home, whether in the United States or the United Kingdom, to get a direct sense of what the explorers were discovering. Now, of course, some of these explorers were reasonably decent amateur artists, and that's all well and good. But when they came home, sketches and narratives in hand, how could they possibly convey or communicate the stark sublimity of the polar regions to people who had never gotten closer to them than perhaps a block of ice in their icebox? And I think that's the challenge, and it's a challenge that has to do both with the history of aesthetics, the idea of how to represent something, and it's also very much shaped by technologies of vision, beginning, of course, with painted canvases and ending up on the far end of the century with actual moving pictures. So I will try to give both of these histories in a kind of a parallel, at times alternating, at times staying with one or another of these strands. And wonderfully for us, and for this particular exhibit, these strands come together in the work of William Bradford, whom I've taken to calling, as he is referred to in one of the handbills for his lectures, the photographic artist. So it all begins in 1818, the annus mirabilis of polar exploration, and with this fellow, Sir John Barrow. He was the second Secretary of the Admiralty in the UK, and that's actually a pretty good position. You could probably keep that seat warm forever until you die. And so, as a result, you have a certain kind of persistent influence. And he was convinced, based in part on reports from the whaler William Scoresby, that the ice was receding from the polar sea in such a way that it was the time to send forth expeditions, and he had the power, in fact, to do so. So in the year 1818, he launched two expeditions, which we'll talk about in a moment. One to seek the North Pole, might as well start by being ambitious, and the other to find the vaunted Northwest Passage, which is the sea route across the north of North America. Legendary, much desired, some have called it the Arctic Grail. So he's a very key figure, and he lived into the 1840s, so was in a sense at the helm of many of the British expeditions. But there's also this fellow here, John Croker, who was the first Secretary of the Admiralty, and like Barrow, had come from a fairly humble set of upbringing. He was not as much of a fan, I think, as Barrow, at least not quite as passionate of a fan of Arctic exploration. He also had literary aspirations, wrote some novels, some histories, a new edition of Boswell's Life of Johnson, which everyone thought was terrible. And he also wrote book reviews. Interestingly, he wrote a very bad review, a very critical review, of this book, which also came out in 1818. Now, if you haven't read Frankenstein recently, you probably may not recall that, in fact, the frame narrative of Frankenstein is set in the Arctic. It begins there and it ends there aboard the ship of a fictitious Captain Walton, who is searching for that wonderful chimera of the 19th century, the open polar sea. You would think that sailing north and encountering more and more ice would lead one to believe that there is still more ice up ahead. But the British thought, what if it's actually warmer up there? What if there's actually a tropic island up there? What if after you get through the ice barrier, as they took to calling it, you could just sail very conveniently, say, to Russia or China? So this is actually Captain Walton's dream in Frankenstein. He's interrupted by the sudden arrival of Victor Frankenstein, who is driving dogs across the ice, something that in general the British thought was not quite proper. It is a sign that he and the creature, who shows up soon after, are neither of them quite of the civilized sort. So these two expeditions that I've mentioned, one was led by John Ross. Here's a great polar portrait of that man, a Scotsman, as were many of the most eminent British Arctic explorers, and a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. And Ross's charge was to seek the Northwest Passage, and also in the course of this to map Baffin's Bay. We've all heard of Baffin Bay, as it's now called, and it had been discovered in the 16th century, but no one had gone there since. Some people thought it was just a myth. So Ross's orders were to sail up into it and to sail along all of its edges and to keep a special eye out for any sorts of inlets or indentations that might possibly be the fabled Northwest Passage. And the other fellow who was sent, actually not as the commander, he was second in command under another Scotsman, David Buchan, was this fellow, Sir John Franklin. Well, he wasn't knighted yet, he was just Lieutenant Franklin at this time. And he was an idealistic, somewhat moralistic, but also very kind-hearted and how shall we say, the legend of Franklin is that when he was on an Arctic land expedition and there were so many mosquitoes that men were losing their minds, he would not swat them. He blew them off his hand. He couldn't stand to see men whipped. He was a man with a heart of gold. And, very junior commander at this time. Most of the officers in the Royal Navy were being put off on half wages because we didn't need them anymore. We'd beaten Napoleon. So Franklin was quite fortunate in securing this berth, and he was in command of the Trent, and Buchan was in command of the Dorothea, and they just sailed straight north on the theory that eventually, if you do this, you will reach the North Pole. Instead, they reached some very savage sea ice in which both ships were trapped and damaged almost to the point of sinking, and then repaired to Spitsbergen for emergency repairs, really, and then back to England with nothing particularly accomplished, one might think. But the battle with the ice, that was the key. So this is the chart that Ross returned with, a fairly impressive chart. Thousands of miles of hitherto uncharted coastland, much of the lower coast of West Greenland, much of the coast of Ellesmere Island and Baffin Island and so forth. I mean, it's really quite an astonishing feat to have mapped all this. You would think that he would come back to the thanks of a grateful nation after this extraordinary voyage. And in this scene, he also encountered the northernmost human inhabitants on Earth, the Inuit of northwest Greenland. They had not seen any other people, Inuit or other people, in living memory. When they saw the ships, not as they are shown here in this drawing by Ross's interpreter, with their sails out, they saw them moving and believed they were living creatures. Their first question to Captain Ross was, "Do you come from the sun or the moon?" And so this was, of course, quite a marvelous thing, and Ross, being a Scotsman, dubbed these strangers Arctic Highlanders. And this was their greeting. Their dialect was so strange that even his interpreter, who was born and raised in Greenland, had a difficult time making it out. But the trouble with Ross was just one thing. He played it safe. He saw a few passages and openings. In one case, Lancaster Sound, he believed the opening was blocked by a range of mountains. Just to be on the safe side, he named the mountains after Croker as first secretary. But his other commanders, including Edward Perry, who was his second, did not see these mountains, and Ross was widely blamed when he got home. He had been on a pleasure cruise. He hadn't risked life and limb. No battle with the ice for him. Who cares if you discovered new people and new places? What have you done for us lately? What's your struggle been? And so, of course, he was pilloried in the press. Here's a cartoon from the 1820s in which Ross is standing atop the pole and proclaiming George III, the emperor of all of the countries upon and beyond the pole. You can see Britannia at her writing table with a lion, I think, a rather small lion underneath it, and various people singing Ross's praises. There's Vesuvius. He got, of course, as did Baron Munchausen, into the air by being blown out of Vesuvius, and conveniently has landed upon the North Pole. And the title of this cartoon and the book that accompanies it is Munchausen at the Pole. So he was made a figure of fun and folly. Much to his distress, was retired from the Navy and never got another command, not under the Navy's watch anyway, again. But Franklin and Buchan got the royal treatment. They both got promotions and further expeditions, and they were also featured in the first massive piece of public art depicting the Arctic in the 19th century. The description here of the view of the north coast of Spitsbergen at Henry Aston Barker's Panorama in Leicester Square. Now you have to see, there's a cross-section of what the panorama was. The building actually still stands, although it's now a church and hasn't got a panorama in it. But 240 feet across, the lower or great circle, and on every inch of every wall of that is hung an enormous oil painting. Burford was quite keen on the fact that nothing was ever done in watercolors or distemper. This was oil painting. After all, this was fine art. And it was painted in such a way, and with special tricks of perspective, that after entering through this darkened corridor you see at the bottom and ascending to the viewing platform, you almost felt as if you had traveled in some kind of a mysterious ship and arrived yourself at the destination depicted in the great circle of the panorama. It was silent, it was quiet. I mean, you could speak with one another, but I think the atmosphere was rather more like a museum than a public exhibition or fun fair. This diagram also shows the lesser circle, which was added at a later time so that you could have two different subjects, two different panoramas. Size, it turns out, did matter, though. The larger one really did have the illusion of being transported to a place. Of the upper one, people often felt, because the canvas was too close to their noses, that the effect was incomplete. So this is the program that was handed out, the original program. We don't have any of these great circle panoramas surviving, not a single one, sad to say. But the programs show us what they look like. And this one is conveniently numbered so that you can observe all the various forms of flora and fauna that are to be seen here. Among the people who visited this panorama was the poet John Keats, who, writing a letter to his sister-in-law, said it was impossible to describe. And I think that's personally rather high praise. If John Keats can't describe it, it must be fairly impressive. You can see there, we'll look at this detail here. The two figures at the front there are number 3 Buchan and number 2 Franklin. Over there at number 4 is Mr. Fisher, the astronomer for the expedition. Someone else is sitting on a barrel. Another man is probably hunting seagulls or something. And then, of course, at the top, number 12, which in the key is labeled simply Ice Barrier. So actually, if we go back for a second to the full view, you can see that the two ships are here. They've come back to Spitsbergen after their battle with the ice. One of the difficulties with the panorama is it really couldn't show motion. So you had to find some moment in space and time when things were standing still. And as the ships are being given emergency repairs, the commanders are out there exploring. If you want to find out about the walrus, there's a community up there in the northeast, described as a ferocious and hideous beast. They did not think walruses were cute in the early 19th century. Flying up there on the rocks, there is the glaucous gull, if such things matter to you. And of course, this natural scenery, the jumble of rocks and ice, the majestic power of nature. Here, the sun shining through after the storm, perhaps a sort of a hopeful beacon. Franklin actually posed for this segment with him in it, and then avoided the area of the panorama. He said, "I am afraid that someone shall see me on the street and call out, 'There goes the man in the panorama.'" But because they thought of these as almost hyper-realistic. They were so realistic, you felt you were there, and if you saw someone that you had seen in one of these, you might very well feel free to approach them in public. Now, Perry, Ross's second-in-command, if you will recall, did go back and did sail down Lancaster Sound and did, in fact, get farther into the potential route of the Northwest Passage than anyone else ever was to do in the 19th century. And he stayed at a place called Winter Harbor on Melville Island, and he did something that no other British expedition had ever done before. He wintered over. They parked the ships in the ice. They put banks of snow and ice around them to protect them. They put deck canvas up over the masts and formed a sort of a tent over both of the ships. So you have a sort of a warm area up there where the men could go jogging or something. They had shipboard theatricals, shipboard schools, and of course they had to endure about 2.5 months of absolute and utter darkness. So when they came back, they produced, as was traditional, a large illustrated folio volume, illustrated with these beautiful aquatints, and this particular one is colored. The original print is just a sort of a brown grayscale. But just gorgeous with the light of the stars, the frost and ice up on the mast and the crow's nests, and this lone figure vainly endeavoring to warm himself before a fire. This really was the Arctic sublime, the realization that the power of nature in the Arctic regions was so profound, so absolute. You know, once winter hit, there was nothing you could do except stay still and pray. And these were the things you did. And the sublimity of this scene, of this spectacle, the power of the ice to freeze everything. A piece of bread in your pocket was like a slab of stone by the time you came back from a short walk outside the ships. It's a very similar feeling to, I suppose, what we might have had looking at some of the early videos of the astronauts in space. And of course, artists, fine artists, picked up on this. And this is Friedrich, his wander among the sea of clouds or sea of fog. And, you know, the mountains were an attractive place for the Romantics. They, too, were an emblem of the sublime power of nature. You know, previous to the Romantic period, only crazy people went into the mountains. You know, madmen and hermits and people who were fleeing the law. But now poets and artists went to the mountains and came back with some account of what they had depicted. You know, the Byronic hero, as in Manfred, you know, leaping from mountain peak to mountain peak like some sort of a goat, you know, pursued by evil forces, pursuing evil forces, who knows what. Interestingly, the wanderer is faced away from us. We don't see him or know anything about who he is, but we also know that his gaze, to some extent, is our gaze. And I think that's the key thing here. And then, of course, this painting, which was inspired by one of Peary's later journeys, an expedition on which one of his ships was crushed in the ice. This was the HMS Fury. Friedrich read about this in the local German papers and was inspired to go out onto the river Elbe, where he painted this ice from observation. I think somewhere in the process of observing it, he must have magnified it somewhat, because it looks, you know, so massive. And here, you know, when you see this reproduced, sometimes you won't even notice the ship there. It's so crushed, it's so obliterated. You know, just the little stern of it is showing there, and a little bit of one mast. You know, it's being devoured. It's been devoured. It's too late. There's not a single human figure in this scene, of course. This is like some of others of Friedrich's canvases of abandoned monasteries and such like things. But here, you know, it's the cold holiness of snow. It's the desolation, the monastic isolation of a world in which there's no hope. Right? This sometimes is mistitled "The Wreck of the Hope," which is a different and now lost painting by Friedrich. So that's had that associated with it as well. But the Sea of Ice, Das Eismeer, is really, I think, the best title for it. You see ice as this profound power that crushes a ship without a thought. There's really nothing you can do. It's too late, and you are too weak to do anything about it. And it's you know, very much like the mountains, a demonstration of the great force of nature and the great indifference of nature to human endeavors. Now, there was another form of panorama, not the big circle sort, but the kind that unfolded before the audience on gigantic spools. This was the so-called moving panorama, and probably the most popular art form of the entire 19th century. It was big, but it was light enough to be packed up and moved by railway car or perhaps by horse and buggy from town to town, so it could travel. And it could, you know, it would probably wear out the paint before it wore out its welcome. There was always somebody who hadn't seen the panorama, and you could move on to the next town. Unlike the great circle panoramas, these had a narrator, so someone could stand there. In the later period, sometimes explorers themselves were recruited to describe firsthand their terrible exploits while, you know, painted icebergs and whatnot rolled by. But of course, the Arctic was a logical subject for this kind of entertainment. It was in the press, it was in the news, it was in people's minds. And it didn't take long for it to appear in panoramas as well. This is a panorama by a fellow named J.B. Laidlaw. Laidlaw had all kinds of subjects on his mind. War, always popular in panoramas. Depictions of the Holy Land, city of Jerusalem as well. But in the midst of all this, Ross's voyages feature. Now, this was actually not Ross's first voyage, which ended up with him being pilloried, but his second voyage, a private one, in which he actually did survive remarkably 3 years among the ice with a little bit of help from the Eskimos. And when he came back, he was suddenly not a failure, but a great lion, because he had struggled. And so his struggles in the ice were the subject of this panorama. And in this case, we're very, very fortunate to have, this is from the collection of Doug Wamsley, who will be giving one of the other talks in our series, this marvelous watercolor by Mr. Laidlaw himself. Probably a preparatory sketch. These panoramas were also painted, but not usually in oils. They were usually done in distemper. The people who painted them were often also theatrical scene painters and the like. And as you can see, they had a somewhat less than photorealistic sense of how people might look. This entire group, including Ross, who's on the left holding a spear, and this group of Inuit, including a woman who demonstrated her happiness by dancing around with an ulu in each hand, are all richly plagiarized from Ross's book. And there's no sign that Mr. Laidlaw approached Mr. Ross and asked for permission to use these. But at any rate, and the icebergs, really purely fanciful in a way, and a ship of some kind which is in open water, which is odd since Ross's ship was trapped in the ice from almost the moment he arrived. So, but you can imagine this is part of a moving panel that would unfold the story, the arrival of the ships, the meeting with the Eskimos, the man with the wooden leg who had his leg built for him by the ship's carpenter of Ross's ship. So it was a narrative form. It had one thing after another rather than everything all at once. And that turned out for something like this to be a great way to tell the story. Now, Ross himself, not to be outdone, took his own views, some of which you can see depictions of in the Arctic Visions exhibit, and hired an artist to turn these into dioramas. And this is a word we'll come back to. What exactly was a diorama? It's not the shoebox thing we think of today. But at any rate, these dioramic paintings, based on Ross's own, and therefore authentic and accurate, one presumes, reference images of the Arctic, along with the other ever-popular Belshazzar's Feast. This is, of course, the feast where the writing appears on the wall, a very popular illusion with panoramas and dioramas, and various other miscellaneous subjects. Admittance to all the views, 1 shilling. People thought a little bit less of Ross because of this, because he was making money off of his exploits. That didn't seem quite right somehow. This also appeared in Boston at a place called the Boston Diorama later in the 1830s. And Ross was also treated to this extraordinary show at Vauxhall Gardens. 60,000 square feet of ground were devoted to a sea of papier-mâché icebergs, a papier-mâché replica of his ship, the Victory, men dressed as Eskimos, polar bears and whales, evidently people in costumes. It's a little hard to tell how this was all done. An enormous battle among the bergs, after which Ross himself, in person, and several of his comrades would appear in a whaleboat and row their way into the audience. This was sort of, the Walt Disney World treatment here, or the Universal Studios theme park, where the guy dressed as the Terminator comes out of the screen. Very, very successful. It was repeated 3 times at Vauxhall, concluding, as usual, with an exhibition of fireworks. Now, as to the diorama, it's hard to say what Ross's images were, but the diorama proper was a very specific device, and it was actually invented by Daguerre, the same man who will later invent photography itself. But before he did that, before he was the master of realism, he was a master of illusions. This was built at Regent's Park in London. The circular thing you can see there in the overhead view is the audience platform. So the audience sat on this like in a theater in the round. And it gradually rotated from one view to the other. There are 2 separate chambers, in each of which was a dioramic view. You would watch one go through its whole cycle, and then the platform would rotate with you on it, and you would behold the other view. And as you can see in the cross-section behind the screen on which you saw this diorama, there was all sorts of apparatus, and there were shades, there were lights, there were colored windows, there were bits of glass, there were magic lanterns projecting things. All this in an effort to create the illusion of reality. Now the diorama did change, but it didn't change quickly. The sun went down, the moon came up, the ghosts of dead monks emerged from their ruined abbey. Now this took about an hour. It was very, very gradual. So gradual as your eyes adjusted to the darkness, as you gradually could make out figures, that people swore they could actually see these figures as though they were as true as life, even though they realized they were illusions. Now, unfortunately, very few dioramas, in fact, only one, survives. This was painted by Daguerre himself in, I think, 1831. It's a view of an abbey church, and it was actually hanging in a church in France for 150 years. They had coated it with dark shellac, or shellac that had darkened. It was in very bad shape. Now the Getty Museum is restoring this, and as part of a test of the apparatus, they tried front lighting and back lighting it, and you can see the difference it makes. Some of the portions of the canvas, like the windows there, are deliberately made translucent. So when you light it from the back, it's as if natural light is pouring in through the church windows there. When you dim that light and light it from the front, everything takes on a different cast. So imagine a show in which you would go from view A to view B. It would take about 40 minutes to an hour. People were patient back then. They were willing to wait for something spectacular to happen, and it was the slowness, the gradualness of it that in some ways made it spectacular. Now, of course, Daguerre went on a few years later to invent the first widely used photographic process, the daguerreotype, just to indicate something of how difficult this process was to master. Here is a typical daguerreotypist's kit of the day. You would have to obtain copper plates, you would have to coat them with silver, you would have to polish the silver, you would have to sensitize the plates in a box with iodine fumes, and having put them through that process, put them in a frame, expose them for a very long time. The early processes, I think the first few daguerreotypes took hours, if not days. Eventually I got it down to perhaps 10 minutes. And then, of course, the plate had to be removed and developed, which involved heating up mercury and exposing it to vapors in another box. Then that image had to be fixed. Some people liked it to be gold tinted. The process was time-consuming and expensive, and it produced a beautiful image. Let's just say daguerreotypes have a level of detail that is practically infinite. The grain size is the size of a single silver halide crystal. It's microscopic, but it's expensive, time-consuming, and it produces just one. And that, I think, is the great limit of the daguerreotype in terms of representing, say, outdoor scenes. You can make one, but when you've made one, that's the last one you can have. You could make a daguerreotype of a daguerreotype, and people did, but you lost a great deal of the detail in the process. The idea of the daguerreotype in some of its earlier advertisements was that it was in fact the sun who did the painting, not human hands at all. Here we have the earth posing for its portrait by the sun, who's holding a little palette of paints and whatnot. The idea of the daguerreotype as essentially natural, not even really having human intervention, unless of course the human operator failed in the process in some way, was a very widely distributed one. And it's the beginning of our idea that the photograph conveys reality somehow much more efficiently and dramatically and completely than, say, the artist's brush could do. But not everybody felt this way. Here's a wonderful cartoon from Punch magazine from the 1850s of an interesting group posed for a daguerreotype by a friend of the family. And here is the interesting and valuable result. People look awful. People did not want to see, apparently, how they actually looked. They didn't want to see that their children looked like the ghastly crumb tinies, or that their wife's hair looked like it hadn't, been properly tended, or that their nose was unusually large, or any other little thing. And the daguerreotype, of course, captured people so perfectly. One of the complainants here was the Duke of Wellington, who claimed his nose was too large in the daguerreotypic portrait that was taken, perhaps forgetting that in the Napoleonic Wars, his nickname among his troops was Old Nosy. At any rate, we take the photograph now, and we've learned to take the photograph as a guarantor of a certain kind of reality, at least in the pre-Photoshop days. But even when it first arrived, some people were a little suspicious. They felt that there was something dark about it. One person called it the fiendish mirror of Daguerre, which sounds pretty creepy if you think about it. And here is John Franklin, some years after the earlier portrait, about to set off on his ill-fated, and I love that phrase, ill-fated. The ill-fated expedition is the best kind if you want to have immortal fame, but of course it's ill-fated, so you probably won't come back. And here is Franklin. He and all of his senior officers posed for daguerreotypes. They were taken by Richard Beard, who was one of the very first photographers active in England. And after obtaining these, he took two of each officer. One set was given to the nation, one was given to Jane Franklin, that was Sir John Franklin's wife. Then they took the apparatus onto the ship with the purported idea of exposing daguerreotypes in the Arctic. No one, I suppose, really thought about how difficult it might be to produce iodine or mercury vapors when it's 20 degrees below in the hold of a ship. But at any rate, if any plates were made with that apparatus, we don't know about them. The apparatus itself and the plates and the ships and all the other things, including this fellow here, have all gone missing and are still being searched for to this day. But we have these wonderfully crisp, clear, detailed images. This is a grayscale copy. It's the best I could find. But if you see the originals at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, they've been gold tinted and the cheeks painted a very subtle shade of pink. So they really do look remarkably alive. Although they're also in keep cases or frames that have a curved top, always makes me think of tombstones in a way. And indeed, that's how they were shown. This is the same set of daguerreotypes reproduced as engravings in the Illustrated London News a few years later. People, again, turned to the daguerreotype. What did the officers look like? Let us have accurate depictions of them. But there wasn't at this point in time any direct way to transfer a photograph onto a piece of paper, so you set the engraver to simply making as good of a facsimile of what the photo showed as possible, with perhaps just a few little touches to make people look. Franklin seems healthier here, and that last one he looks quite ill. Here there's a little bit more bloom on the rose, and so forth. And of course some of these officers are posed with their, the Le Vescount there with the book in his hand is posed with his book of signals. Many of them have telescopes. This of course shows what good navigators they're going to be. I like the fellows who have their arms crossed. They look like they're not going to take any guff from an iceberg. But what's interesting here is that because of the daguerreotype, even though it's not easily reproducible, images of the Arctic and its explorers could indeed be reproduced in a way, in a fashion, very accurately, stuck on a printing press and distributed widely to tens of thousands of people. And of course they could cross the Atlantic. This is from a Boston publication of the day, Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion. And here, well, they're slightly less effective. These are woodcuts, I believe. But again, copies of the daguerreotypic images so that people in Boston who were wondering what had become of these poor lost explorers would have something to feed their imaginations with. And interestingly, as with this, and you'll see some of the other illustrated papers, the illustration itself was the feature. The actual story about the expedition might not fill 1 or 2 column inches. But the great engraved scene or scenes of the explorers were what people really wanted. Now, at the same time, I hope I'm not confusing muddying the photographic waters here. At the same time as the daguerreotype, there was another process, a very early one, first developed by, among others, William Henry Fox Talbot in England, in England called the Talbotype, more commonly today the calotype. And this is a process that uses paper instead of a metal plate. The paper is sensitized, exposed. Again, the early exposures were rather lengthy. The advantage with the calotype is you could actually make a copy of it. You could take that piece of paper with the image that you got, put it up against another sensitized piece of paper and print off a sort of a contact print. And if you did it twice, you could turn positives into negatives and negatives into positives. And this is quite a famous image. This is by a fellow named David Octavius Hill, early Scottish photographer, who besides turning the camera on his friends, went down to the town of New Haven and photographed some common fisher folk in their everyday attire. The tonal range of the calotype is wonderful. It's really quite astonishing, but it doesn't have that tiny granular level of detail. It's on paper, and paper can only be so detailed, right? But you can imagine, thinking about this process, that you could certainly take this to the Arctic if you wanted. It's all done with liquids and paper. There's no gases. Nothing has to be heated up. It's a process that actually could have some practical use, even under difficult circumstances. Now this, interestingly, on the left here is Dr. Harry Goodsir. He was the naturalist aboard the Franklin expedition. He was a friend of David Octavius Hill's and was working in Edinburgh at a museum there. And someone, perhaps Hill or perhaps someone else, turned the camera on him and made this calotype that you see at the left. I think this is a quite small image. It's greatly blown up, and it was probably exposed to some light over its lifetime, which has caused it to fade, so it may have had a bit more detail. But on the right you can see the beautiful gold-toned daguerreotype of Goodsir taken in 1845, 3 years later. And that's not even a particularly good reproduction. So if it's the explorers we want to see, clearly in this sense the daguerreotype has a sort of an advantage. But if we actually wish to take a camera into some place as foreboding as the Arctic regions, the calotype process would seem to have the advantage. Now, as Franklin disappeared and stayed disappeared, he became the subject of a great deal of speculation. This I think of as sort of the equivalent of your CNN header, War in the Gulf or something. They used this as a header for several running issues, the latest updates on the search for Franklin. Here it seems the polar bears are doing the searching, and let's hope they don't find the lost explorers. But it has icicle letters and all this sort of wonderful detail. People felt that they had a personal stake in this. It was the disappearance of Franklin in some ways that both reminded people of the sublime power of the Arctic, but also piqued their imagination, made them want to see more. And the Illustrated Press was prepared to do it. Here's an American publication, the Dollar Monthly Magazine, with quite a lengthy piece about Sir John Franklin's expedition, beginning with the last view of the ships from a passing whaler. And the rest of it, of course, is 100% speculation. We have a lot of this in the news today. What's happening somewhere? We can't tell. We don't have any reporters there. Well, let's show some drawings, why don't we? Let's recreate the scene as it might have taken place. Let's try to imagine what people are experiencing somewhere where we can't have first-hand accounts of those experiences. So there are quite a lot of these kinds of things, and of course illustrations to go with them. Finally, in 1854, another Scottish explorer, Dr. John Rae, encountered a group of Inuit who had with them relics that were clearly associated with Franklin's expedition, including, reproduced on either side of the portrait bust there, his Guelphic Order of Hanover, his medal, which you can see him wearing in the daguerreotype. So this was clearly not something that Franklin or his men would happily part with. This seemed to be a very bad sign. Also, broken chronometers, part of a knife that's been remade into an ulu, some marines' buttons, a glasses case, and forks, knives, and spoons with the officers' crests. So this was, of course, taken by people back home as a clear sign that Franklin's men had met with their end. They certainly wouldn't have given up these items freely, but how did the Inuit come in possession of them? Now, according to Rae, his informant said they had simply found dead bodies in the snow and had, thinking it couldn't do any harm, helped themselves to the little trinkets and things that they found nearby. Some people, however, had a more sinister view, including Charles Dickens, who accused the Eskimo of pouncing upon helpless explorers, killing them and eating them, and then taking away their utensils and jewelry afterwards. So, the idea of the Eskimo, certainly on the one hand, as an explorer, you want to meet with the Eskimo, you want to get their advice, but they might be hostile. I like this engraving because it's not quite clear if they're hostile or not. And the sailor there in his fur garments certainly has he's not aiming his rifle, but he has it handy. And so I think one of the other questions, and of course the one way back of Ross was drawn by Sackhouse, it's one of the few Inuit depictions. What could the Illustrated Press, what could photographs tell us about these strange and curious people? Could it give us some of their humanity, or might it indeed, on the other hand, take it away and depict them as a lot of savages? But the debate over Franklin's fate had a lot to do with people's assumptions about the Inuit, and Rae and Dickens found themselves on different sides of the argument. Not surprisingly, Dickens won. People just couldn't credit Rae's account of cannibalism, although it's since been shown to be true. Now, another search for Franklin was that of Dr. Elisha Kent Kane, you see in the center of this group here, and another famous early illustrated paper, Frank Leslie's. This is actually the very first issue of Frank Leslie's ever printed. And the caption informs us this is from an ambrotype by Brady. Now, we all know Matthew Brady, the Civil War photographer. But this is a new process that we should briefly mention at least. The ambrotype was done on glass, and it produced essentially a negative, and it was developed and made sensitive with liquids. So it also potentially could loan itself to use in the Arctic. and it had that wonderful, glowing detail. It had the very, very fine grain detail that you would get in a daguerreotype, but it came out as a negative, and a negative begets positives, and more positives or more negatives. It could be turned into a lantern slide. It could be made the basis of an illustration in a newspaper. It really had the quality of reproducibility as well as the quality of truth. Now, in this case, the ambrotype, this is based on, is lost. We have some copies that aren't very good, but we do have this, which I think is quite fascinating. It wasn't discovered until a few years ago, and this is an ambrotype of Cain himself, just by himself. And he's not wearing fur garments. It's some sort of a wool hood or something, an anorak, I guess. And he has this wonderful, wistful look. You wouldn't get this, I don't think, in an engraving. Maybe you'd get it in a painting. But the painter would have had to paint very quickly, since Dr. Cain fell ill and died within 6 months of returning from the Arctic, and within 8 months was dead. So this has a very sort of poignant, like the Franklin portraits, a kind of a memorial feeling to it. The late, great Dr. Cain, whose funeral train was the second longest only to Lincoln's in the 19th century. Now, I'm afraid, completely forgotten. Now, of course, Cain's exploits also were the subject of panoramas. What we're looking at in the 19th century is many different kinds of media, all going at once. So, of course, we have the photograph, and then we have the engraving based on the photograph, and we have the book in which Dr. Cain narrates his exploits, and then the illustrations for the book, again, richly plagiarized, become the basis for yet another panorama. This one appearing in Philadelphia, and later touring England and all over the world, by Dr. Edmund Beale. Incidentally, his nephew, Joseph Boggs Beale, is thought of very highly as a lantern slide maker, but Boggs Beale painted his slides. They were not photographic slides. And this, too, was really based, the painting was very much like Laidlaw's, painted with distemper on canvas or linen, and would probably have seemed somewhat cartoonish to us today, but was very popular in its time. Now, alas, a few years later, this last note was discovered, not far from where Franklin was last reported to be seen. It's a note that's gotten a lot of attention, and here it's a photo facsimile engraved and printed in Harper's Weekly. The center part of the note says, "Everything's fine, we're making great progress," and then there's this horrible scrawl around the edge. "We've abandoned the ships. Sir John Franklin is dead. 29 others have died so far. We're setting out tomorrow to seek help." And it's like, and you didn't find it. Because by the time this note was found, 16 years had passed since the men had last been seen alive. So, aside from a few skeletons in this note, that was all that remained. And the great era of the search for Franklin was over, for the most part, although, as I say, the Canadian government is still peeking around up there. Some panoramas took this as a cause for a great sort of recursus of every single expedition ever undertaken. This, I think, is the largest panorama I'm aware of. It calls itself a diaphanic diorama, but it's almost certainly a painted panorama. And it has every single explorer, every single journey, every single voyage between 1820 and 1860. All one after the other. I think you might have suffered from fatigue after seeing this one. But there's also this figure. This is Isaac Israel Hayes. He sailed with Cain on Cain's first expedition as the expedition's medical officer, and then he returned to the Arctic some years later, again pursuing that wonderful, non-existent thing, the open polar sea. Cain and his servant William Morton had claimed to catch sight of it. Hayes was anxious to do the same, and he set out, although he didn't know it, on the eve of the American Civil War, on a little schooner he dubbed the USS United States. And he actually didn't get as far north as Cain had gotten, and he ran into terrible troubles on his sledge journey. It appears that he may have exaggerated quite how far north he got. But he did take with him an artist's eye. He had some training as an amateur artist. And he made this sketch of his furthest north point. You can see the coast of what he claimed to be the Arctic Sea off to the right there. An engraved version of this was the frontispiece of his book. And he named that peak in the middle Church Peak, after the American artist Frederick Edwin Church, who, like Hayes, was a member of the Geographical Society and who may possibly have given Hayes some painting tips. This he presented evidently to Church. It's still in the collections at Church's home at Olana, and Church used it as the basis for this far more astonishing painting. You can see Church Peak there in the background. Church also moved the SS United States into the view, and there, that desolate, icy wasteland. And then the Aurora Borealis. Of course, Church was committed to painting things from life, and he hadn't seen the Aurora Borealis, but he happened to see it one day on Mount Desert Island, Maine, so he simply borrowed the Aurora and moved it to the Arctic and produced this wonderful piece called simply Aurora Borealis. For years, when I only saw reproduction of this, I thought the little white spots were damage or something, or broken bits of the painting. They are stars. Church also painted this really astonishing painting, which was lost for a great deal of its history, called simply The Icebergs. He added, before taking the painting with him to London, the broken mast in the left foreground as a kind of a silent tribute to Sir John Franklin, now known to be dead. So that attracted quite a bit of attention, as did the curious boulder on the other iceberg. The idea of icebergs transporting ancient geological detritus from distant regions was quite enrapturing. Now, Church had, among other things, gone up on a steamer north of Newfoundland with a friend of his to observe icebergs from life. So he had some claim to be the very first person who had actually painted them, who had seen them. And again, painting is encroaching upon that territory of the real, that territory first opened by photography, but which now painters can return to, and to which they can bring, among other things, the incredible sense of color. People do have this sense that the Arctic is white, and it's just not true. It is probably the most colorful region on Earth. The deep aquamarines and blues, the blazing oranges as the sun is reflected on the sides of these bergs. All of these, the little band of blue of azure, almost there you can see at the left, these are Arctic colors, and these are the colors that Church himself had observed. And this painting made quite a splash. It sold for an enormous sum of money to a gentleman who put it up on his third-floor landing where he forgot about it. The building turned into a girls' school, and the director of the girls' school discovered it, 110 years or so later. And this sold at auction at Sotheby's, I think in 1970-something, for what was then the highest price ever paid for a painting by an American painter, and is part of the reason that William Bradford, who we'll talk about in a moment, came back into view. And here he is, the man of the hour. Bradford in many ways was not, in his early years, unlike other maritime painters. He knew about ships and rigging and how to paint water in a lively fashion. In fact, he studied, his studio in Fairhaven had a square window that looked out over the water. Many people have compared this square window and the ships passing by to a kind of a virtual moving panorama, except that, of course, it didn't have canvas in the way. And he was indeed quite accomplished at this. But at some point, and for reasons we're not quite certain about, Bradford caught this Arctic fever. It may be that he had read Church's little book, After Icebergs with a Painter. It may be that he had seen the icebergs when it was displayed in Boston or New York, both cities in which he worked, and had studios at various times. At some point, he decided he too wished to paint the Arctic from actual observation and experience, and he began chartering ships. I love this. Now, he had done several of these over the 1860s. This is the 1869 one, the most ambitious one, and the one with the panther, the images from which, of course, illustrate his books and became the source of much of his reputation, and on which he was accompanied by Hayes, who I think he brought along partly for the cachet of his name and partly because Bradford and Hayes had some things in common. He wanted to take exploration and art and merge the two. So what better way to do that than to have one representative from each party? But this appeared in the New York Times along with other ads in the New York Herald, one of which actually advertised berths were still available. So if you wished to join a batch of artists on a journey to the Polar Sea, you could do this. And interestingly, even though seeing the Eskimos and so forth was part of the attraction, one of the key aspects of this voyage was to retrace, to follow the track pursued by Doctors Kane and Hayes, and to actually go into the deep Arctic, into the high Arctic, beyond just seeing a few bergs drift down through the Newfoundland Straits. And you'll note here at the bottom, 2 skillful photographers have been engaged to accompany the expedition, and a small number of passengers, not over 5, will be taken into the cabin. At this point, Hayes was not committed to it, but later he did, and he did indeed sail with it. Now, to get some photographers, Bradford turned to the firm of James Wallace Black. He was famous for having taken the first aerial photograph in the Western Hemisphere, an aerial photograph of Boston, which you can see here. And by 1869 was operating a very successful studio in Boston with a partner and several other people under him. So he assigned two of his top men, you might say, Messrs. Dunmore and Critcherson, to accompany Bradford on his voyage. And they were doing a process that was close kin to the ambrotype, the so-called wet plate collodion process, called that because once you sensitize the plate, you can't let it dry. The clock begins to tick. So it has all of the wonderful advantages, using liquids, using glass. You don't have to vaporize anything, but it does have a stopwatch associated with it, which of course can raise some difficulties, as you might imagine. Now here's a print. This is a beautiful albumin print of one of these slides, one of the glass plates they exposed. They would go off the ship about as far as they could go. They built themselves a small studio on board the ship, I think 6 by 15 feet. They had suffered some difficulties on the way up. I recently learned that more than half of their glass plates broke in shipment, so they were forced to go to a hardware store in Halifax and buy replacement glass. If I had known that, I forgot that, but it's a wonderful story. They also found a photographer in Halifax who helped them smooth and coat the plates so they would be usable. So they would have to expose these plates and then get back to the ship before the collodion, before the emulsion on the plate dried. And then they would have to develop them on the spot and fix them and preserve them. It's a really kind of a tough set of conditions. You can only go as far away from the ship as you can jog back, I guess, in time to get your plates into the bath. But this is also significant to me, though. This is not from the collection of the museum, although they have some magnificent ones. This is from Frederick Edwin Church's personal collection of photographs at Olana. Now, Church only once or twice was ever known to use a photograph for a painting as a basis of a painting, but clearly he admired this sister art and I think admired Bradford's work as well. Now, the other thing that Bradford decided to do with his plates, since, as I say, the great thing about glass plates is you can duplicate them, is he wanted to turn them into a lantern lecture. And this is another popular 19th century entertainment, a series of views which would fade or dissolve one into the other. Glass plates were a perfect medium. You could make positives from them that would be just the right size to fit in a projector. They'd be very bright and clear, and the limelight was the light of choice for these. This is oxygen and hydrogen gas burning and impinging on a cone of lime. It's very bright, much brighter than any other light of the 19th century, so you could throw these things brightly and largely on a distant screen. And so Bradford thought, well, not only may I use these photographs as the basis for my paintings and making my paintings more truly realistic, why not give a lantern lecture? But he was a little shy about doing it himself. So he hired this fellow, Mr. D.A. Wasson, who was a transcendentalist philosopher and a speaker who had been on the 1869 voyage as a passenger. Dr. Wasson was a little reluctant at first, but eventually agreed. Bradford gave him a list of slides, and Wasson worked up some remarks. But when they actually got together to give the show, Bradford just started putting in one slide after another in different orders. He had rearranged them. Poor Mr. Wasson was left with nothing to say about some and plenty to say about a few that weren't even shown. And the initial viewing was widely regarded as a complete and utter disaster. But the one lesson I think Bradford learned from this experiment was give the lecture yourself. And so he did. This is a poster from the New Bedford Free Public Library, but as you can see here, this particular exhibit, which was given by Bradford, was not the first of his new show. He had already done this in Boston and had some testimonials, not only from Nathaniel Shirtleaf, who was at the time the mayor of Boston, but also from Louis Agassiz, the famous naturalist. So this is clearly a dignified, serious, educational showing. It is not just cheap showmanship here. And the idea here that you will be taken on a kind of a virtual trip, again, sort of like the panorama or the diorama. You will be transported to the realm of ice and snow, and you'll be given this tour by someone who has been there. There's the authenticity of the person, there's the authenticity of the photograph. What more could you ask for? And Bradford must have gotten better and better at this because his reviews were quite good. Again, this was not his main line of work at the time. He was still working on large commissions, and the idea was to show people the photographs. Perhaps they would commission a painting of the same subject. But he gave a fair number of these to all kinds of audiences. Once in New York City to a bunch of boy bootblacks who were sitting around idly looking for something to do. And at the invitation of the police, Mr. Bradford gave them an Arctic stereo view show, quite remarkable. But of course, again, they could be duplicated. Mr. Black, who presumably also retained either the original plates or copies thereof, made his own set of slides and went around the country with those. So Mr. J.W. Black will give an exhibition of views of the Arctic regions with his stereopticon, the most complete of any ever used in this country, illuminated with a new chemical light, the strongest artificial light in the world, and this is the limelight. These were taken by Mr. Bradford. This is an interesting question here because Bradford, although he had hired Black's photographers, constantly referred to the photographs as his. He may have taken some, we're not sure, but he certainly felt there was a work for hire kind of an arrangement there, I guess. And even Black here, although those were his photographers, refers to these as Bradford's views. Now, giving a lantern lecture would seem to be a fairly safe occupation, but alas, no. You might have been safer to go on a journey to the Arctic regions because the hydrogen and oxygen were supplied in bags. The tank for gases not having yet been perfected, the bags would have a board placed on top of them and then some weights to produce constant pressure. But occasionally a little accident happened, such as happened to Mr. Black and Dunmore, who was serving as his assistant at a church in Lowell, Massachusetts, when the whole thing exploded. Mr. Black was deafened, Mr. Dunmore was blinded, and a piece of wood was driven through the nose of the organist, and the entire organ loft completely wrecked. Disappeared in a photography journal. Happily, Mr. Black and Mr. Dunmore recovered from their injuries. No word about the organist, but I love the end of the account here. We have not yet learned the cause of the accident. When the explosion occurred, some old revolutionary female spirit innocently inquired of her neighbor if that was the signal to commence the exhibition. So eventually, Bradford and Hayes, now it's interesting, we've recently learned that Bradford and Hayes had actually tried to put out the photographs along with a narrative much earlier than we had known, trying various other ways of reproducing photographs. The photogravure process hadn't really been worked out yet. There were other kinds of things like the heliograph, which could work, but perhaps would darken the images too much. And the cost of producing such a volume, by whatever process, was a little bit daunting for any publisher to undertake. But after his trips to London, where Bradford experienced great success, including a commission from Queen Victoria and one of her daughters for paintings based on the photographs he had shown them, he suddenly realized that with that kind of cachet, it would be a fairly simple matter to sell a very elaborate book by subscription, especially with the Queen herself at the head of the list of subscribers. Why who could say no? And so he contracted with a firm in London to produce this volume. I haven't seen the term used elsewhere, but it's said to be an imperial folio. I think that's probably just a sort of a sly reference to Queen Victoria's having subscribed to it. A beautiful tooled cover. It's quite an enormous volume, and the beautiful inlay there of the icebergs and the polar bears. And Bradford hit upon the expedient of actually printing photographs, actually making albumen prints and inserting them into the book as being more accurate, more beautiful, and indeed they are, ways of representing the photographic truth of the Arctic regions. And if you think about it, there was a claim to be an edition of 350. We're not sure if that many were actually ever made, but with the number of illustrations, we were talking perhaps 30 or 40,000 albumen prints would have to be made to supply every single edition with every single plate that the surviving editions possess. So we don't know how far they got with that. But the ones that have survived are just magnificent. I mean, the typography is gorgeous. Curiously, the plates are reproduced at less than the size of the glass plate. This might be because Bradford didn't have the full-size original plates available to him. It might have been because of cost or time concerns. There was evidently some difficulty in getting that many photographs printed in a while. And the text may or may not have been entirely by Bradford. He hired a sort of a ghostwriter to assist him in making the narrative as compelling and engaging as possible. But in terms of combining the text and the narrative, in the way that a lantern show would have done, but doing it so on the printed page, it's just an absolutely magnificent thing. And there's a copy on display, and you can look at the electronic version. But if you can possibly manage it, I recommend to arrange a visit with an actual copy and a pair of white gloves. Here's another page. This is from chapter 6. And again, one of the things I noticed in the wonderful republication of this by the Whaling Museum is that, in fact, most of the images are larger in the republication than they were in the original, sometimes quite a bit larger. So it's a little bit hard to make out the group there, even at this large size, but these images are much, much larger in the reprinted edition. The text has been retained in every particular. And very late in his life, well, not very late, in the last, say, 15 or 20 years, Bradford was having less success, I think. He had spent some time in the Rocky Mountains trying to get some suitable subjects there. These great, huge paintings, like Sealers Crushed by Icebergs, were becoming a little bit less popular. It was harder to find people to purchase them. And so he spent the last couple of decades of his life giving these lectures, but in a new kind of a way that he called the Bradford Recitals. So this is, of course, the centerpiece from the Arctic Regions book, the double-fold image of the Sarmitsialik Glacier. And these were advertised. They were given at the American Geographical Society, at large theaters in New York and Boston and Chicago. It was a prestige event. And for this, not only did Bradford have his slides and his lectures, but he had obtained slides from other explorers of the day, the commander of the Jeannette, the American explorer Adolphus Greely had loaned him their glass plates, which he included into his lectures. And he had also hired a young woman named Miss Ruby Sinclair, who sang weird Eskimo songs. That's what it says in the handbills, weird Eskimo songs, 3 of them, which moved the audience visibly. So I wish we could reconstruct those. Here also is a very scarce little pamphlet. This was evidently given out to people who attended some of the early recitals. Thomas C. Lombard was a rather successful Boston theater and tour manager before he was imprisoned in 1899 for defrauding people. But at the time he was a highbrow kind of a man. And this kind of elaborately printed booklet, it has a list of all of the slides, all of the individual views grouped in the order they were shown, along with some narrative text. So this is clearly the kind of thing you would take in along with perhaps a visit to the symphony. You would not simply be informed and enlightened, but you would be swept away on photographic wings. You would, in a sense, be taken on a kind of a virtual tour of the very places where so many men feared to tread. And the Whaling Museum is extraordinarily fortunate in that it has, in its collections, the last version, I guess we could at least say, of Mr. Bradford's own slides. Now, he changed this lecture several times over the years, and sometimes you can see more than one little numbered sticker. Some of these are in his own handwriting. So clearly he was experimenting with the content of the show, or liked to vary it, or perhaps for different audiences had a shorter or a longer version of one of his shows. But here you actually can see these are the views that were projected. And if you go to the Arctic Visions exhibit in the far right corner, I recommend you can see a reconstruction of the first of these lectures, which we have the text for, accompanied by its original slides and narrated by Terry Borton, a modern-day lanternist extraordinaire who sounds like he came from the 19th century. And you can watch a recurring loop of those, and they're quite beautiful. Here's another one that has a couple of these little gummed labels. I'm almost positive that's Bradford's handwriting, comparing it with his letters. And as you can see, that number 48 is pasted down over some other number in which this occupied in a series. You can also tell from the slides that some of them, although not all of them, were commercially available slides that anyone might have purchased. Some of them, however, have no label, and these I'm assuming, hoping, thinking, might be the very ones prepared for him by Mr. Black's studio in Boston, who was still active throughout this entire period. So in his declining years, Bradford gave, I don't know how many hundreds of these. He gave one at Vassar, he gave one at Amherst, he gave lectures in small towns sprinkled around New England, and of course in Boston and New York. And when he died in 1892, this is his obituary from the New York Times, reflecting on his illustrious career as an artist, but it has one little paragraph that I think is very poignant. Mr. Bradford was in much demand as a lecturer on the Arctic regions. He used his collection of photographs in his lectures. He lectured before the Amateur Camera Club on Friday evening, only a few hours before he was stricken with his fatal illness. So here is the man, dubbed the photographic artist in some of his early descriptions of his appearances. Certainly an extraordinarily gifted artist with a brush, but who spent much of his latter part of his life giving these photographic displays, and indeed, almost one could say died in harness. He gave his last lecture, he went to his hotel room, and he collapsed on the floor, and he died the next day at a hospital. So I think we've seen here, I hope you'll have felt that I've taken you on a journey as well, from the point of time when people seeking to understand and see the Arctic regions really had to do a lot of work with their imaginations, and could imagine the most fabulous things, what lies, after all, off the edge of any map. To a point where people became accustomed to and desirous of seeing not just sketches and paintings and whatnot, but actual photographs taken at the actual place, transported to their homes or into a theater where they could see them and be swept away by them and overwhelmed by them, where they could actually see as closely as possible exactly what the explorers saw. And I think even though, of course, these other expeditions, the ones that Bradford showed, were all, many of them at least, rather tragic. Many people died, ships were crushed, and so forth. That was actually, I think, part of their appeal. The Arctic sublime outlasted the period of the Romantic painters, and it carried on through these photographic representations and even, I think, into some early films. This was the ultimate test of the human spirit, and if you could accompany an explorer on this journey and see the horrific perils that they faced, it became even more thrilling to you. And then, of course, when the lights came up, you were still safe and sound. So, anyway, that's my talk. Thank you.
Do we have time for questions? Let's see. Sarah, can you turn up the lights a little? Thanks. It's 8:22. So.
Sorry, I went a little over there.
Yeah. Well, would anyone have any questions for? Well, I guess we'll call it an evening. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you.